In the summer of 1907, in a county office that smelled like damp paper and lamp oil, a clerk unrolled a plat map that was already older than he was. The land parcel sat just beyond a low rise where the fields dipped into soft ground after rain. On the newer survey, the shape was gone. No ring, no notation, no warning, just a bland label in neat official handwriting, drainage fault. But on the older plat, the one folded so many times its corners had turned white, there was a circle. Not a random mark, not a stain, a deliberate boundary, measured, closed, centered on a patch of land local families had avoided for years. And beside it, in smaller script, nearly hidden by a crease, two words that should never have been there at all: giant graveyard. That is where this story begins, not with a myth told around a fire, not with a sensational newspaper headline, but with a quiet correction inside the paperwork. One map says circle, the next one erases it. One record names the place, the next one explains it away. And once you see that change, once you understand what was removed and what was left behind, the entire county starts to look less like farmland and more like a crime scene that was flattened, fenced, and filed into silence. Because the strange part is not that rural communities pass down stories about oversized bones, sealed mounds, or graves too large to make sense. The strange part is how often those stories appear right beside survey anomalies, vanished plats, reclassified soil features, and sudden changes in official language. A hill becomes a rise, a chamber becomes a sink, a ring becomes runoff damage, and a graveyard becomes a drainage fault. Ask yourself something. If the county really believed this was only a wet ground defect, why did older residents refuse to plow through the center? Why did one surveyor note the circle at all? Why do later records preserve the shape of surrounding parcels with perfect care, yet blur the one feature people kept whispering about? By the time the newer survey was copied into the county book, the land had already begun slipping out of memory. Fence lines changed. The nearest lane was renamed. A family who once held the tract sold it under pressure after a series of washouts no one could explain. And the men who had first measured the circle were either dead, retired, or no longer welcome in county business. That alone would be enough to raise suspicion, but then came the testimony. A farmhand said he saw stone slabs pulled from the earth there before sunrise. A widow claimed her husband returned from the site with mud on his boots and would not speak at supper. A gravedigger near the end of his life reportedly said the county did not want a graveyard on record because it would stop excavation across half the basin. Then a local doctor entered the story, and what had looked like folklore began to sound like the edge of a suppressed file. Because according to one account, bones were found inside the circle. Not one skeleton, several. Too large, he said, to belong to any man he had ever treated. And if that sentence sounds impossible, remember this: impossible discoveries do not need everyone to believe them. They only need the wrong person to see them before the paperwork changes.
The official story, as it survives now, is painfully ordinary. The county depression was cataloged as unstable ground. Seasonal water pooled there. Surface collapse created misleading contours. Farmers, being farmers, gave dramatic names to troublesome acreage. End of story. It would be a clean explanation if the earlier records did not keep getting in the way. The first credibility layer in this case comes from timing. The oldest plat appears before the county standardized many of its drainage terms. That matters. It means the man who drew the circle was not borrowing a later engineering label and then exaggerating it into local legend. He was recording a feature the way he found it, using the language available to him. The circle was distinct enough to map, distinct enough to preserve, distinct enough to separate from the surrounding low ground. Then there is the witness at the center of the case, Elias Varden, assistant survey clerk. not famous, not powerful, exactly the sort of man history forgets until his handwriting becomes a problem. Varden copied tract boundaries, checked acreage totals, and compared older field notes against revised township sheets. He was not a treasure hunter, he was a paperman, the kind who noticed when numbers failed to match. According to a family letter cited decades later by his granddaughter, Elias brought home one corrected survey and told his wife that they have turned the ring into a fault. That phrase matters because it suggests translation, not discovery. He did not say he found a fault. He said something else had been reclassified into one. Why would a survey clerk care? Because surveyors live and die by distinctions. A stream is not a ditch. A mound is not a spoil pile. A cemetery is not unusable swamp. To relabel land on a map is not just description, it changes ownership, value, restrictions, and memory. And memory is where the second witness enters. Her name appears only as Mrs. Halley in a church ledger note from 1919, but the story attached to her is consistent with several oral accounts passed through the area. She said her late husband, a teamster hired for hauling, took part in an early morning removal on the ringed tract. He believed he was moving fieldstone. Instead, he and two others loaded flat tops and deep box stones onto a wagon under orders not to stop in town. He came home pale, washed in silence, and burned a shirt the same evening. Years later, after drink loosened him, he told her one stone had covered a cavity longer than a horse and wrong in its shape. Wrong how? He never answered. That is the rhythm of this case. Each source gets you one step closer, then recoils at the edge. Then the doctor appears. County physician records from that period are incomplete, but a private notebook attributed to Dr. Samuel Reeve was mentioned in a local estate inventory in the 1930s. The notebook itself has never surfaced, yet two separate secondary references describe one page from it. On that page, Reeve allegedly noted a visit to a ringed depression excavation, where bone fragments were presented for comment. He reportedly wrote that the cortical thickness was abnormal, the scale inconsistent with ordinary burials, and the fragments not from stock. Not from stock. In one line, he eliminated the easiest explanation. Not cattle, not horse, not ordinary refuse from a farm pit. And then, just as the record starts becoming dangerous, it begins to disappear.
A single lost notebook would not mean much by itself. Rural records vanish all the time. Basements flood, families burn papers, courthouses misplace boxes. But what deepens this story is not one missing item. It is the pattern of absences surrounding the circle. The Plat survives in one copied form, but the field book tied to it is gone. The doctor's notebook is listed in an inventory, but not found among the estate remnants. A county roads memorandum references grading near the tract, yet the attachment map is missing. A local historical society index once included a folder labeled Old Basin Excavation, but the folder is no longer in the drawer where the catalog says it belongs. One missing record is bad luck. 4 starts to feel like handling. And still, fragments remain. In the 1950s, when post-war crews widened a nearby road, an equipment operator reportedly struck dressed stone below topsoil depth where no foundation was expected. That alone would be strange, but an elderly resident later described the pieces as curved, like they had belonged to a round wall or collar. The county explanation was simple fill material, imported debris, construction junk, yet no one could explain why carefully dressed stone would be buried in a sealed ring area that had already been marked unstable decades earlier. Then came the photograph. Not a clear one, not the smoking gun people dream about, just a washed-out black-and-white image from a farm sale archive showing 3 men, a wagon, and behind them, on slightly raised ground, a partial arc of stone emerging from torn earth. The image matters because on the back, in faint pencil, someone wrote, "West side of the circle before county men came." Before county men came. Who were the county men? Surveyors, engineers, road crews, or a cleanup team sent to make sure an awkward discovery did not become a public dispute? At this point, the skeptic has every right to push back. Old maps are messy. Oral history grows teeth over time. People exaggerate. Memory mutates. That is true. It should be true. A good mystery does not survive without pressure. But now consider the rehooks this case keeps offering. Why does the older Plat not just mark a circle, but isolate it from adjacent drainage features? Why do testimonies repeatedly describe stone cover elements instead of random bone scatter? Why do later records normalize the site only after reports of excavation? And why, above all, did local people stop calling it the basin and start calling it the place under the fault? That last shift is subtle but revealing. It sounds like language people use after an official explanation has been imposed from above. First, they have a place, then they have a label, then the label swallows the place. There is another testimony, rarely mentioned, by a school teacher named Lorna Pike, who interviewed older residents in the late 1960s. In a typed page preserved by her nephew, she notes that one former laborer described hollows set in a ring, some opened, some untouched, and insisted the openings were spaced too evenly to be natural collapse. Pike, careful and restrained, did not endorse the claim, but she underlined one sentence twice. The men were afraid not because of what they found, but because they believed someone already knew it was there. That changes everything, because fear after discovery is one thing, fear during discovery suggests expectation. Someone had instructions, someone had limits, someone understood that this was not just land, it was evidence. And if it was evidence, the next question becomes unavoidable. Evidence of what?
To answer that, you have to zoom out from the county and look at the broader pattern hidden across older landscapes. Throughout North America and parts of Europe, there are recurring stories tied to circles, mounds, lower foundations, sealed chambers, and oversized remains. Official history tends to treat these as separate categories: native mound sites, colonial cemeteries, sinkholes, quarry pits, drainage problems, folklore, misidentification. But in place after place, ordinary witnesses describe the same disturbing sequence. A strange feature is known locally for generations, then disturbed by work, then briefly acknowledged, then reclassified, fenced off, built over, or reduced to a harmless entry in a bureaucratic file. The sequence matters more than any single claim. Known, disturbed, acknowledged, reclassified. That is exactly what seems to happen here. The county circle was known long before modern excavation. Children were warned away from it. Teams avoided cutting straight through its center. Older plats preserved it as a meaningful boundary. Then some form of opening occurred. Stone was moved. Bone was reportedly seen. A doctor was consulted. And only after that does the official language harden into drainage fault. If you were trying to disappear a burial complex without staging a public scandal, that is almost the perfect phrase. It sounds technical, it sounds dull, it discourages curiosity. It turns a question into a defect. And once you notice how useful that language is, other choices begin to look less innocent. The road grading near the tract compressed the outer edge. New property lines fragmented the surrounding acreage. A drainage ditch was cut in such a way that spring runoff would further soften any shallow features. The original family parcel was split and sold in pieces, making coordinated re-examination harder. Even memory was broken into smaller pieces. One old farmer remembered bones. Another remembered only stone. Another remembered wagons at dawn. Another remembered county men posting warnings.
each testimony alone could be dismissed. Together, they form the outline of an operation. Then there is the broader theory, the one people are usually told not to touch if they want to be taken seriously. What if the circle was not merely a cemetery, but part of a much older layer of occupation? Not a single grave, not even just a graveyard. A structured site from a population whose physical scale, burial customs, or architectural practices no longer fit the accepted story of the region. That sounds extreme until you remember what bothers people most about buried history cases. It is not just the size of the claim, it is the suggestion that the landscape is older, stranger, and more engineered than the official timeline admits. A ring of stone, deep cavities, oversized remains, missing notebooks, reclassified maps. That is not proof of giants by itself, but it is exactly the kind of cluster that makes people wonder whether the giant story survived because it was the only language locals had left for something clearly outside normal human expectation. Maybe giant meant literal height. Maybe it meant massive bones. Maybe it meant a people larger in build than later populations. Or maybe it meant something even more destabilizing, that the county stumbled onto the remains of a forgotten stratum of history and lacked any safe vocabulary for it. And when institutions lack safe vocabulary, they do what institutions often do. They rename the problem until it stops asking questions back.
Now imagine the human reality beneath all of this. Imagine standing on that ground before the fields were leveled, before the ditch cut through the basin, before the paperwork went sterile. The ring is still visible then, not dramatic from a distance, just wrong enough to pull your eye. The grass grows differently over it. Water gathers at the edges, but not the center. A frost line lingers there in spring. Animals hesitate. Men notice, then pretend not to. Then the earth opens. A slab is exposed, then another. Beneath them, cavities, orderly, repeating, made, not accidental. And inside one, remains that do not fit the story your century is prepared to tell. That is the historical pressure point, not whether every rumor was accurate, not whether every witness used precise language, but whether the land itself preserved something that collided with the acceptable version of settlement, burial, and human scale. Because if even part of the testimony is true, the implications spread far beyond one county plat. It would mean entire classes of local discoveries may have been neutralized not through dramatic cover-ups, but through administrative digestion, quiet relabeling, missing attachments, revised surveys, polite denials, enough ambiguity to make future researchers sound foolish before they begin. And that mechanism is powerful because it does not need a grand conspiracy. It only needs a chain of small decisions by people protecting careers, contracts, land values, or institutional stability. The surveyor says, better call it a fault. The commissioner says, no need to alarm anyone. The doctor writes a note, then never publishes. The teamster tells his wife, then swears her to silence. The next generation inherits the rumor, but not the file. This is how buried history survives in modern countries, not in temples, not in encrypted vaults, in county ledgers, estate lists, family letters, map corrections, words changed by one careful hand because the truth, left in plain language, would force too many new questions. And the biggest question of all is not just who was buried there, it is who knew. Who knew enough to rename the circle? Who knew enough to move stone before daylight? Who knew enough to make sure that later viewers would see only a drainage problem where an earlier map showed deliberate form? There are darker implications, too. If sites like this were found more than once, if rings and lower chambers and oversized remains appeared across multiple counties, then the buried past story is not a fringe curiosity. It is a censored category. A class of discoveries handled the same way whenever they surfaced too close to plows, roads, or county growth. That possibility should trouble everyone. Because once a civilization learns to erase by paperwork, physical destruction becomes almost unnecessary. You do not need to blow up the past. You only need to recode it, change the label, update the sheet, archive the witness under folklore. Then wait. In 2 generations, even the descendants will say, maybe it was just a swamp. But the old Plat did not say swamp. It did not say collapse. It drew a circle. And circles on old land are rarely innocent.
Today, if you go looking for the site, you will not find a sign. No plaque, no protected marker, no official acknowledgement that anything unusual was ever mapped there. You will find ordinary ground, worked ground, forgettable ground, the kind of place people drive past without slowing down. Which may be the most unsettling part of this entire story. Because buried truth does not always hide in dramatic ruins or famous deserts. Sometimes it sits under county soil, beneath pasture and runoff, inside records so boring no one expects them to lie. A changed term, a missing attachment, a copied plat with one surviving circle that should not still exist if the land was only what they later claimed. And that leaves us with the final tension. Maybe the witnesses were wrong about the size. Maybe fear enlarged memory. Maybe one chamber became many in retelling. But even the narrowest reading still leaves a hard core that refuses to go away. A deliberately marked circular site, older local avoidance, reported stone-covered cavities, bone examined as non-animal, and a later official reclassification that made the entire anomaly sound geologically harmless. That is not nothing. That is the shape of a buried case. A case where the paper trail does not vanish completely. It flickers, it stutters, it survives just enough to implicate whoever tried to flatten it. And maybe that is why stories like this still spread, not because people are desperate to believe anything strange, but because they can feel the difference between a mystery and a managed explanation. A mystery invites investigation. A managed explanation closes the file before the questions are even asked. So when you hear that old accounts of giant graves, sealed circles, or impossible bones are just legends from uneducated times, remember how often those legends stand exactly where the maps changed. Remember how often a witness appears right before the terminology does. Remember how often the land is ordinary only after the county has had time to rename it. Somewhere under that field, if the testimonies are even half true, there may still be untouched hollows in the ring, chambers no plow reached, stones no wagon hauled, evidence waiting under the same earth that was told to hide it. And if that is true, then this story is not really about one graveyard. It is about how many more circles were turned into faults before anyone thought to compare the plats. If you're the kind of person who notices where the record changes, who reads the erased word instead of the replacement, who understands that history is often hidden not by distance but by revision, then stay close to this channel. Because the buried past rarely disappears. It gets relabeled. And once you learn to see that, you start realizing the map is still talking. Most people just never learned how to read the silence.